Well, kia ora, and welcome to a mini hoon on the kaka to Anthony Walker, who is the Director of Government Ratings at Standard & Poor's, and who has just come out with a very interesting report on the new water authorities that councils are setting up under local water done well. Thank you very much for jumping on the kaka, Anthony.
Thanks for having me.
So you've come out with an excellent report today, which essentially gives people more information about the implications for council credit ratings of their moves, and there are lots of different flavours of the moves, their moves to set up separate water authorities. And you've said that under these reforms, known as local water done well, it's not necessarily the case that councils will find themselves in a less leveraged situation once they so-called move their water assets off the books, and that the benefits may not be either there or immediate or obvious. Could you talk a bit more about your note today?
Yeah, sure. I'm here today, the analytical issues that we see when it comes to the local water reforms, when it comes to councils. The councils have been provided up to 6 options by the Crown via a DIA guidance document earlier this year or last year. And what we've done here is gone through how we would view each of those 6. Now, only 3 of them are being pursued by councils. So not really looking at pursuing a trust, for example. And what we've found is that there's 22 councils doing business as usual, another 8 doing a single owned entity, and another 38 potentially merging into 12 big entities. And their rating outcome does depend on which option is chosen. As you highlight, some will be better off, some will be worse off, and some will be somewhere in the middle. And what we've done here is we've found that, or we're showing the market and the councils right now that if you are going to go out there with financial guarantees, it's not going to be off the books to credit ratings.
Yes, you've got a line in your report which I think re-summarises the issue. In capital markets, off the books doesn't always mean off the hook. So could you explain a bit more about perhaps the gradation of how you assess whether a council is deemed to be still on the hook and therefore it's the separate authorities' debt is actually consolidated or included in your assessment of the council's debt, and when there might be a complete separation where you're comfortable that if a water authority gets into trouble, the council is not necessarily going to jump in and bail everyone out.
Yeah, and one of the things here is that we don't rate to accounting standards. Accounting standards, they vary from very good to very bad across the world, and we work in all systems globally. And even in New Zealand, we don't think the accounting standards there are as holistic as others. Operating leases and capital leases are a prime example. That's debt in every other market in the world, advanced market that we work in. But we put those on balance sheet, even though the accounting standards in New Zealand say no. And that's what we talk about when we say in capital markets, off the book doesn't always mean off the hook, because the accounting standards might say it's not there, but when councils are guaranteeing it, it is there. We've had people say to us, well, we're only going to guarantee it because we don't think it needs to guarantee. Well, capital markets and investors don't believe that. That's why they want the guarantee. So you can't really have your cake and eat it too. If you're going to get cheaper interest rates because you're guaranteeing it, well, then the government is going to have to bail it out when something goes bad. And that's what we kind of look at a holistic approach. Guarantees are one thing we look at. The other kind of things we look at is what's the role this entity is playing? Is it doing a port? Is it doing a commercial business, retail business? Or is it doing an essential service like water where people can't live without? Are there other providers of water in the system in your area? And if the answer is no, and this is the only water provider that gives you water to live on, obviously, and the council are owning it, obviously it's going to be very essential. And then the other thing we look at is the role and the linkages between the council. And this is where the 3 waters from the former Labor government kind of try to separate this with the iwi ownership. And I know that wasn't very popular throughout the country, but that was why they went down this path, is to try to dilute the linkages to council control. Because if the council is controlling it, they're appointing managers, they're appointing boards, they're signing off statements of intent, they're signing off decisions, and now they're guaranteeing them. This is a council entity. They can't just wipe their hands and say, not my fault, not my responsibility. By the way, I have a watertight guarantee on it. These things will come back to bite you. We've seen them around the world. In fact, we have seen many governments around the world step in to bail out businesses which are not guaranteed, and they're not water providers. So this is why we kind of look at a holistic approach about what may or may not happen. And you mentioned about what we look at as basically separated. Under the government's 6 options they provided, the one that we would consider probably less likely to be involved with a council would be a wholly owned consumer trust, which controls the entity, and they control the pricing and they control everything. Under most councils, they don't want to give up the asset. They want to control the underlying asset, and that's part of the issue. The other area we saw is water care. So water care, we have separated from Auckland's balance sheet, and that's specifically because legislation bans Auckland from providing any financial support at all. So we believe if something goes wrong with water care, it's going to be the Crown who has to step in to support it. And these are different things, because maybe a smaller council, we could pull water off the balance sheet of a small council under that rule, but how would that entity go and borrow? It can't borrow in the same terms as water care. It just can't do it from the sheer size.
Yeah, because the impression that some people might have gotten from the discussions about the local water done well reforms was that this was a way for councils and the government to essentially avoid the big debt that needs to be taken on to fund maintenance and expansion, sometimes repair of existing water networks that has been variously estimated in the tens of billions of dollars, and that it's sensible that a lot of this would be covered by debt. But the idea was that this was somehow debt separate from councils and separate from government, and therefore it wouldn't necessarily increase the interest costs of the existing debt. But what are you saying here? That actually, depending on the closeness of the final arrangement, this may not actually make much of a difference. You still may see interest costs relative to no change at all. Interest costs still rise.
Yeah, potentially. And I mean, we're one aspect of the markets, the way we look at credit ratings. The biggest determinant of the credit costs in New Zealand, the interest cost, is the LGFA access. And the biggest determination of council debt caps or the limits of borrowing is not a credit rating. They can keep borrowing, we'll keep rating them. We might rate them in the triple B category in a decade's time where they borrow massively. They can still borrow. The biggest pullback on the leverage of the sector is actually the LGFA debt caps. So the LGFA was to loosen those. They could still borrow through the LGFA, which is still rated AAA on the local currency scale. So that is one area where credit ratings can have an influence, but the credit rating is an outcome. It's not an input. The government and the council should be looking at these water reforms as what best suits the system, and the rating comes out the other side.
Yeah, if you were from another planet and landed in New Zealand and asked the question, gee, there's an awful lot of financial restructuring and shuffling of assets going on here with the ultimate aim of, in theory, reducing the cost overall to taxpayers and ratepayers. Is that the case? Are we going to see that? Or is it just a lot of shuffling?
There is a lot of shuffling. Some of these reforms do have an impact. They do matter. They mean that some councils can borrow more under certain structures than they would otherwise at the same rating. But if you look at the cost of debt for the Crown is the cheapest. Councils are the second cheapest. Non-councils are the third cheapest. So that's a water utility or a bank or something else. Given that a water utility, particularly a small one, which most of these councils would be, would likely be a standalone credit profile, maybe in the triple B, maybe double B. it means that the council guarantee, which would lift that back up towards the council level, would actually be very vital for it to get cheaper financing. But then again, if it was all on the balance sheet of the council and the council was one notch lower on the rating, it may still be cheaper that way because the LGFA is the ultimate determination here of the credit quality and the credit rating.
Yeah, and the LGFA, for those people who don't know and may not have heard of it, it doesn't advertise itself like Coke, but it is a major player in this process because it is the government guaranteed, partly owned vehicle that effectively borrows on behalf of councils and in a way lends its credit rating, and you could argue the strong credit rating of the Crown, the government, to the councils. Could you give us a sense of how important that LGFA borrowing is and how important the Crown's backing for it is in the minds of investors and yourselves as a credit rating agency?
Yeah, definitely the Crown support, whether it's equity position or whether it's a credit line. They do provide a large credit facility to the LGFA in case it needs it. That supports the LGFA rating. The LGFA itself is de facto a bank. It has a balance sheet, it manages the risk. So while the councils, we did lower 18 council ratings this year, the LGFA rating wasn't impacted because they were actually kind of countering that with higher capital requirements and higher assets to kind of shore up their credit quality. So they are managing that risk. What happens when the councils borrow through the LGFA, and the councils own the LGFA? So they are ultimately the decision makers here. The LGFA will increase the cost that they borrow from the market. They borrow at 3%. They'll lend it onto councils potentially at 3.25%. If you're a better rated council, maybe you get it at 3.1%. So they actually determine the difference in outcomes here when it comes to council interest rates rather than what the credit rating may do if councils were borrowing directly in the capital markets. The credit rating would have a much bigger impact on the cost of debt in New Zealand if these councils were borrowing outside the LGFA.
Yeah. Have you done any sort of work on, what the relative costs of borrowing might be under these various new structures, local water done well structures for councils in the government versus, I suppose, the status quo of simply the councils doing the borrowing through LGFA, and maybe a few of them might have to take a ratings cut?
Yeah, we haven't yet. There's a couple of reasons. We don't know whether these entities will borrow through the LGFA. We believe they will. That's why the guarantee is being proposed. But we also don't know what the spread the LGFA will charge. As I said, it ranges from, say, 0.1%, 0.25% for a council with a rating of an A or higher. A lot of these entities may not be in the A category. So I'm not sure what the actual on charge would be to these entities. If you look at what I just said, a council early this year, we downgraded 18 councils. Going from a double A to a double A plus and double A rating had no impact on their interest cost. Going one notch below that from a double A to a double A minus increased their interest costs on new borrowings, not the existing debt, but new borrowings by 0.05%.
5 basis points, yeah.
5 basis points. So we lowered the ratings again by one notch because they doubled their debt levels from 180% on average to 360%. We potentially may have another 0.05% or a 5 basis point increase in cost.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing. There's been a lot of work done in an attempt by the government and the councils to give the appearance that they are not adding debt to their balance sheets. But I was very interested in the comments that you've made in the note and in the press release along the lines that even though it looks like a shifting of assets and liabilities off the balance sheet, and it may, quote, ease the optics, it may not reduce the underlying credit risk. Is that right?
Yeah, and this is what this note is partly there to tell councils and investors. It's explaining how we look at the 6 options provided, whether they would be outside our credit rating or not. But if you're shifting something to let's say, in-house business unit, whether you've got staff sitting on the floor next to you, you shipped into a single owned entity. The rating, so the revenues may be quarantined, they may have a separate business structure, but ultimately they're probably the same people doing the same job for the same people, and they're probably having the same cost base. They may actually have a bigger cost base if they're going to ramp up their spending. So while it might shift it from the parent accounts in New Zealand accounting standards, they're likely to be captured under the group accounts. So they're still on the broader balance sheet that most governments don't focus on. So when you hear governments, and it's not just New Zealand, they do it in Australia, this is what my parent council, my parent government looks like. Let's ignore all the other things we're doing on the side. So that's a common trait in Australia, and it's probably a common trait in New Zealand as well.
Yeah, it is weird because you often hear politicians say this, and then you think, I wonder what the actual investors in the credit ratings think. And this is a very useful note in explaining what they think. Anthony Walker, who is the Director of Government Ratings at Standard & Poor's, talking to us there. Thank you very much for being on a mini hoon on the Kaka.
Thanks for having me.